Like Craig, I'm glad to be here today. The familiar people and familiar smells of food and the meals being prepared is a wonderful opportunity to be here and to be together. We are going to talk about the present and the future a little bit later with all of you together in discussion style, but we're going to go back in time just for a little bit longer. Discipleship in this world is complex. You have to adapt to your own situation. Any guesses of who may have said that?
Sounds Zinzendorfian.
Does it? It sounds Zinzendorfian? It's not quite. It's actually, it's Reverend Julius Corpening, who was a member of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, who was also the Associate Director of Church and Industry Institute and the Director of Urban Affairs in Winston-Salem. Any guesses when he may have said that? It was the Moravian Church Southern Province Special Synod of 1969. And that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about today. November 1969, 6th through the 8th, 50 years ago this week, more than 200 delegates from across the province gathered together with the intended purpose of clarifying the vision and mission and purpose of the Moravian Church Southern Province. I won't ask you to share your experience, Graham, but I know that you were there. I saw in doing research for today, as well as many others that many of you probably know. Jack White, who was the Synod chairperson for that event, who was a member of Friedland Moravian Church, stated a couple of weeks in preparation for the event to the group of people who were gathered in their sort of final preparations, that he was a bit nervous about this gathering. In fact, he believed that this synod, 1969, was going to determine the course of the church. That there was change that was needed, and that he said the church was not doing its job that the church was supposed to be doing. He went on to say that he was scared because of the responsibility that Moravian Christians have. He said he was scared that this synod, of all synods, 1969, would not see the enormity of responsibility that it had for the church to declare a new direction. You may be wondering what enormous responsibility Jack was referring to, and I can't speak for him, but I will infer that perhaps he was referring to the responsibility that we have collectively as the body of Christ and as the church. The essential features of the unity states that the church is the place where God's fellowship with people becomes a reality. It's a very simple and yet profound definition of the church, stated right there at the beginning of the Church Order of the Unitas Fratrum. The church is the place where God's fellowship with human beings becomes a reality. Of course, we know that the church doesn't always feel like a place where God's fellowship with people becomes a reality. But as we are reminded, the very evidence of the existence of the church itself is an article of faith. We believe in the church, we say in the confession, in the Apostles' Creed. We believe in each other. We believe that God has called us to be together for particular purposes, particular places and times. One of the striking things about the definition that we find in the essential features of the unity is that it states, the inference that we can make is that community is the heart of the church. If the church is the place where God's fellowship with human beings becomes a reality, then community is not simply the heart of the church, but the church is a community. As Craig just stated from our history and theology, the church is a community and exists for community. The Reverend Julius Corpening, who we mentioned a few moments ago, gave a presentation to the people assembled at the 1969 Special Synod of the Southern Province, and he said that neighborhoods are changing. And as neighborhoods are changing, too many churches have become disconnected from their neighbors. For a variety of reasons. He said church members no longer live in the surrounding neighborhood. A church that maybe once was established as the place where people lived and worked and assembled together was no longer the case. And so the neighborhood was changing. And and the neighbors in the surrounding community were no longer members of the church. And he said that to reconnect with our neighborhoods, we have to demonstrate a willingness to listen to them, to befriend, and to learn to share in dialogue with people who are not like us, people whom we do not know, people with whom we do not share our everyday lives, that perhaps we might begin to share life together so that there would not be an us and them, there would be only a we. There would be a church, reconnected and re-engaged with its community, with its neighbors. And it's in that context that he then said, discipleship in this world is complex. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all way of going about reconnecting with your neighbors. You have to adapt to your own situation. There were a number of different segments of presentations that were made and a number of different committees that were arranged, organized in the Special Synod of 1969. And one of them was called Responsibility of the Church in Society. And in one of the resolutions, perhaps one of the most profound resolutions that came out of this synod, they said, Christ spoke to us of God's work in the lives of human beings by saying, I came that they might have life and have it more abundantly. And then they said, but it's obvious to us that humankind is suffering from guilt and loneliness and fears and divisions and hatreds and prejudices and war and violence and physical needs and dehumanizing poverty, all of which keeps people from experiencing the abundance of living that Christ has promised to us. So then they went on. That was in the whereases, which is the things that they state as being factual. We know this to be true. Therefore, be it resolved that our church would state its mission in the following ways, a threefold arrangement of the church's mission. First, that we would share the good news of God's love and forgiveness and spiritual salvation in the Savior Jesus Christ, that we would preach and teach and share and witness together by word, by messages, by storytelling, who we are and who God has called us to be. We would also show the good news of God's love and forgiveness by loving action so that we might win the right to share what's on the inside, what's in our hearts, what we have come to know about God's love and mercy and grace. And then they said, but we will also take public stands for things, for that which we believe denies and destroys the abundance of living for people generally in our society. And at that time, in addition to the many legacies of racism and discrimination, they named housing and education and peace and the equality of opportunity that our neighbors might have. The Special Synod of 1969. It is special indeed. And then they went on and they said, be it further resolved that our church, maybe it was intended to say it twice, that our church will fulfill this mission in the following way. By partnership with Christian communities and agencies across traditions, by substantial investment of our financial resources, by particularizing our mission and ministry to the needs of particular communities, by experimenting with new forms of ministry and by establishing new church communities in areas other than in suburban settings. How do you read the last one? What is an area other than a suburban setting? In the inner city, yeah. Also, certainly by this time, there was an awareness, I think, in the consciousness of people of the poverty in rural areas as well, those fringes of societies, and so I sort of read it as both. But yeah, that we need to establish new church communities, sharing life with people beyond just the places that we normally planned and strategically designed ways, places where we would build a church building. And related to the last one, they said that we understand that if we do that, if we engage with the mission of the church in that way, we're confident that a church like this, that's maybe intercultural or maybe is established for people who don't have the same means of well-being, would not be self-supporting in the ways as we understand it. By this time, it was written publicly in the provincial documents that churches needed to be self-supporting within 5 years. And yes, Tom.
I just noticed all these things are truly wonderful, but there's nothing there about reestablishing contact with our essentials or our roots spiritually.
Yeah.
It's good, but it's not enough.
No, I thank you for sharing that, and I think we should hold that. My presentation is to add to what Craig has said, and so I think we're all, as I like to say, discernment is always addition, and as we're assembling all of this information today, we're all praying together as to what it means for us. Thank you for adding that. There was some significant response to the work of the Special Synod of 1969. And I will say, if you want to go back and read from the minutes of Synod, and partially to Tom's point, although the clarity and the awareness that has emerged of reclaiming the heritage of the essentials and some of those kinds of things, I think has evolved in the last 50 years. And so I think we need to keep that in mind as well, that we're in some ways more aware of the heritage of the ancient unity than maybe we were then. So that's important to keep in mind. So some of the response that emerged in the 1970s and 80s was the emergence of a number of really significant networks of communities of outreach and support to neighbors. All of these organizations, Samaritan Ministries being the exception, which was founded in the early 1980s, the others were all founded in the 1970s. And again, I won't call on Graham, but I know that Graham, you were an active part of some of that, and could certainly speak to the sacrifice and the time and the energy that was spent in those areas, making significant gains in resources and networks of social support to address some of the concerns that were being named by the Committee over the Responsibility of the Church and Society. Is there anything that you don't see here? And again, this is not exhaustive, and I was not there, so limited as my research has been. Is there anything that you don't see there that maybe was reflected in the further resolved claims of the Synod? One of the observations that I've noted is that wherein the church made significant contributions to the establishment of social programs, what we did not see was the establishment of new church communities in areas beyond the suburbs. I'm not suggesting that no one tried. And in fact, there were some congregations in the southern province. St. Philip's, you may know, had a vibrant program to children and families in the community in the Bon Air neighborhood that was very prominent, and people still speak about it to this day as being a significant space for people to gather together and to be together, and that made a huge difference in the lives of their neighbors. But the claim that I'm making for the purpose of this presentation is that on the whole, the southern province did not necessarily invest in the ways that we said that we sought to during this synod. Through the experimentation with new forms of ministry, I think that was rather limited. And the establishment of new church communities in new ways and new places with new people. Yeah, Roberta.
When did Good Shepherd begin?
When did Good Shepherd begin? That was in the early 80s. Am I right? It was in the early 80s, yeah.
Outside of Kernersville.
Yeah, and again, there were church plants that took place during this time, and a part of the conversation that's happening in the province, if you read some of the minutes later, is other significant things that are happening during this time. One, in the 60s, there was a lot of inflation, such that the budget for the Board of Evangelism and Home Missions increased by 25% because it became that much more expensive to build a church in the physical sense of a building, and in the traditional sense that Craig mentioned, that became sort of an expectation in the province by this period of time. Yes?
What I'm thinking of is just the time period.
Mhm.
It's coming off sort of the peak of Christianity
Mhm.
and the Moravian Church. It is just beginning into the decline of both the Moravian Church and Christianity. So my guess is their experience had been a growing church where they could do new ones, and now they're wondering if the ones are going to survive or not.
Yeah, there's ongoing conversations. And again, if any of us would have been in leadership at this time, we can only imagine the weight of anxiety and the decision-making that was happening at this time, and the many different ways that people were thinking about and experiencing the shifts that were taking place socially, culturally, politically, religiously. Very difficult period of time. And we take that seriously. One other point of note, it's mentioned. Two points of note from later synods. It's mentioned that in the 1970s there was a roughly 15% increase, a population increase in Winston-Salem. The Salem congregation at that time decreased membership by 78, and across the province, in the whole. In Winston-Salem, the membership increase was only by 5%. And so they recognized that population growth and church membership growth was not the same. And in fact, there were decline in different ways. And there was also a note, there was a survey that was sent out in the early 1970s. The results came back in 1977. 13 churches said that they were living in a community that has changed around them. And so the province was beginning to think about how do we help congregations to adapt to the reality of a community that's changed. And we wonder if we were to ask now, over a period of the last quarter century, how many would note that, an experience that the community had changed around them. And how do we connect and reconnect with our neighbors in a meaningful, tangible way? So just noting all of those things. As you know, if you've been to Synod, and if you haven't, it's one of the hallmarks that Synod resolutions build on each other. Usually in the whereases begins something to the effect of, when we said this then, therefore, we want to build on that. As far as I can recall, in reading the minutes of synods from the early 1960s through to today, the Synod of 1969 does not appear in any Synod resolution thereafter. So the work of the responsibility of the church and society here, none of this comes back as being mentioned in a specific direct way. Now certainly we can see precursors to some really important work and ministry of the province, but as stated directly, building on the Synod of 1969, we just don't see that. But 50 years later, the reality, I'm not sure anything on this list here of the fears, divisions, hatreds, and prejudices that people experience today that we would feel that we have accomplished that we could then remove it from the list of things that people today are still experiencing. In fact, in the most recent information of the Center for the Study of Economic Mobility in Winston-Salem said that if you grow up poor in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, you have less than a 5% chance of moving out of poverty in your lifetime. As you may know, within the last decade, Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, and North Carolina as a whole has been in the top 10 for families with children who experience hunger and food insecurity. One in 5 people in North Carolina last year did not go to the doctor because they could not afford to. Anthony Giddens, Roman Catholic writer, notes that mission is a call that takes us beyond our little world. The very purpose of intercultural living is to enable us to move from the relative security of our comfort zone in order to reach beyond and to encounter people as they are, where they are, as we are. Our ultimate desire is not survival, but greater commitment to God's mission. In fact, it's been said that the church does not have a mission, but God's mission has a church. Building on this, Bill Cahoy notes that to make any one culture normative, recognizing that all faith is expressed in some cultural way, to make any one culture normative is a form of idolatry. And to promote true welcome and inclusion of our neighbors, to reconnect with them and share life with them, we need to surrender our privilege of being the norm to which everyone else is other. In fact, Anthony Giddens notes that in our reading of Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, where the people say, "Lord, when did we see you?" And the Lord said, "When I was a stranger and you welcomed me," that we often read that as meaning that we need to welcome the stranger. And certainly we do. But Giddens notes that what we do not see is that to become Christ is also to become the stranger. The Apostle Peter, in Acts chapter 10, who really struggled with his own experience of the non-Judeans, or the Gentiles, however you want to read that, their experience of the Holy Spirit. He really struggled with how to make sense of what was happening around him. But then he came to this understanding. He said, "I'm really learning," which suggests also a process that's taking place, that God does not show partiality to one group of people over another. Rather, in every nation, whoever worships God and does what is right is acceptable to God. And this is the message of peace God sent to the Israelites by proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all. There are very few instances of this word for partiality in the New Testament. There are variants, translation notes that we could make to the Hebrew Bible. It sort of carries over from the tradition. But this particular word for partiality is found very few times in the New Testament. And as best we can tell from the study of the scriptures and the writings of the early church, is that they made it up. It's a compound word. And the word sort of assembled together means something like to choose a face, to have before you two faces and to choose one over the other. And very few times, but it's there, one instance here in the book of Acts, Peter says, God does not choose a face. One of the other examples of this word being used is in the book of James, where the writer says, when you show partiality, you deny the faithfulness of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has been resurrected in glory. And then he creates this scenario, one that we can presume perhaps was likely occurring in the community that was in the back of his mind as he was writing. Imagine two people coming into your gathering, and one dresses very fine, and the other dresses not so fine. And suppose that you were to take special notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say to the other, please just stand over here. Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? James is getting right to the heart of human motivation. And he says, you do well when you really fulfill the law of the Scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Andrew?
Yeah.
Further question on wording in
Yeah.
the liturgy, and one that really irritates me, is the use of the phrase in one of the liturgies, referring to, I suppose, whoever is praying in the liturgy, you are the chosen race.
Mm-hmm.
This annoys me no end. When are they going to take out of the liturgy words like that? I find that offensive.
Yeah. The African-American scholar Emerson Powery, who's done a lot of really important research into the freedom narratives of people of color, of enslaved and recently freed African-Americans in the 19th century, was one of the contributing translators of the Common English Bible. And he's written an article that talks about the importance of how we translate the Scriptures, even if intentionally to do so in a literal manner, that we have to be mindful of the changing definition of words and how we understand them, and how the legacies of our churches impacts how people read them. And that we have a responsibility in reading and translating and interpreting the Scriptures to do so in a way that helps to break down some of those barriers.
Well,
Yeah.
to me, it just says that the people who are writing the liturgies, and I hope I'm not stepping on toes here, want to continue this separateness.
Well, I appreciate what you're sharing, Gina. I know that the 1995 hymnal, though it seems like not so long ago, at least from my vantage point, feels like a very long time ago. And I'm not saying that because I'm 34. I'm saying that because looking at how quickly our cultures have changed.
Well, it's Peter who's writing it. Or
Yes.
Whoever wrote
Right.
Peter.
Exactly.
And maybe we need to find another word to translate it.
Right, exactly,
The problem
right.
is not
Right, precisely.
the right word for liturgy.
Right, sure. As you know, many of the liturgies are scriptures. Yeah, thank you for...
What did Graham say?
Graham was just noting that we need to just be mindful that Peter was one of the people who... Peter was the author of the epistles where this is taken. Yeah.
But then that gives the writers of the current or future liturgies the opportunity to make the choice to not use those words, don't choose that scripture.
Yeah, no, I hear that. Yeah, let's keep praying about that as we continue on. It's related to the next slide, in fact. The Unitas Fratrum, we read in the Ground of the Unity, recognizes no distinction between those who are one in the Lord, but sees as its vocation to challenge humanity with the message of the love of God, to strive to promote the peace of the world and to seek to attain what is best for all. I don't know how radical that sounded in 1957, but it still sounds pretty radical to me. For the sake of this world, the Unitas Fratrum hopes for and looks to the day when the victory of Christ will be manifest over sin and death and the new world will appear. How do we go about doing that? How do we prayerfully apply the ground of the unity, which is in itself a reflection of what we read in the Gospels and in the Scriptures? John Perkins, the founder of the Christian Community Development Association, notes that it's not just enough to move into a place, to plant some flowers and to be nice to your neighbors. That won't address the brokenness of people's lives, because the structures of communities are broken. And the church has to invest its resources in developing the community. One of the things that we found of note in the Synod of 1969 was reference to the importance of not just investment of resources financially, but the resources of people. In a meeting of the Coalition to End Homelessness in Winston-Salem, maybe 10 years ago, there was a desire to have a meeting, an event where our homeless neighbors could come and connect with resources. This is before the city with dwellings. And one of the things that they noted, one of the deepest difficulties that they noted was the isolation that many of our homeless neighbors were experiencing. And they said that if only we could connect every person who is homeless in our city with a church that would be able to embrace them and to welcome them and to care for them in that way. But connecting the dots is one of the significant obstacles and invitations I think that we have as followers of Jesus, related to how we respond to this call 50 years later. Chris Rice also notes that when we do express openness and hospitality, receive and give hospitality to those whom we do not know, to people who are not like us, to neighbors that we have not loved well, it puts our own identity at risk. And we cannot remain the same in the exchange. And we'll begin to see that the pursuit of a just reconciliation is a long and costly process. And in short, what will happen in the exchange is that a whole new set of challenges will emerge through which we will have to learn how to be the church. Gregory Ellison, who visited Winston-Salem a couple of years ago, I don't remember who the group it was that brought him, but what was that? The Winston-Salem Foundation. How appropriate. Notes, once we see, we cannot unsee. And that one of the challenges that we have in our communities, in the church, is either an unwillingness to see, wherein there are barriers that prevent us from seeing one another, or from others from seeing ourselves, or that we don't want to see. My own feeling is that those who gathered in the Special Synod of 1969, let's be honest, there was not unity across the room, but they made some significant decisions that I think is a legacy that remains unfinished today. And while I agree with Gregory Ellison that once we see, we cannot not see, if we do not pass down what we have seen, the people who come after us will not see, or can choose not to see. And the conversations about justice and peace and reconciliation and loving our neighbors, all of those really important things that speak to the heart of the life and ministry of Jesus, are conversations that we have to keep having. Deeply human conversations, so that the church might become a place where God's fellowship with people becomes a reality. So here are a few takeaways. At least for me, from 1969. You may have your own. One is that the mission of the church is intrinsically connected with the hard work and daily practice of sharing in community with each other and with our neighbors. And there is no substitute for relationships. That each community and context for ministry is a unique blend of people, experiences, gifts, needs, challenges, wisdom, and cultures, each deserving of respect. And that includes our own liabilities, our own gifts and challenges. The communities that we are called to become are the communities that people need and are looking for. We wonder, how can we get more young people? How can we get more whatever it may be? People need each other. And particularly in places where there is isolation, whether because someone has moved into a community and doesn't know anyone, or whether because of social and structural isolation that's caused by brokenness in the structures of community, people need places where they can go and know that people care about them. I need that. And I trust that you do too. And that's one of the hopes that we have in thinking about the mission and ministry of the church, is that fundamentally as human beings, our needs, our deep level needs, are not unlike our neighbors. We're called to live among and work together to alleviate suffering wherever it may be found. But if we do not love our neighbors, we cannot be faithful to this call. In the ground of the unity, it says, our Lord Jesus Christ entered into this world's misery in order to bear it and to overcome it, so that we would not have to bear it by ourselves. And that we can learn from experimenting with new forms of ministry and community, which we'll talk more about later, by listening, by connecting and reaching out in new ways and new places. Philip Hilsell, who's a scholar of practical ministry, practical theology, said that ministry is the everyday activity of helping people know that God remembers them. Through listening, service, compassion, presence, advocacy, and spiritual care. That is the best definition of ministry that I have ever seen. I've been clinging to that since I read it months ago. What is it like to know that God remembers you? I asked someone that a few months ago, and they said, it means everything. So, a couple more takeaways, and then we'll close and we'll share a meal together. There are no easy answers. Before we get into the discerning and figuring out how you might want to live more fully, more deeply into God's call in your life and place and community, there are no easy answers. There are no quick fixes. There are no prepackaged solutions. There's no one-size-fits-all formula. But there are risks worth taking. Dreams to dream, experiments to try, fears to face, trust to build, neighbors to befriend, relationships to invest in, communities to mend, justice to be accomplished. And there are gifts to give and to receive, and good news to experience and to share. Missionary Leslie Newbigin wrote about 75 years ago that it belongs to the very heart of salvation that we cannot share in its fullness, and to all for whom it is intended share in it together. So that as we go out and we're doing the work of ministry and mission and outreach and connecting with people and hearing their stories, it's not just for them, whoever them is, but it's so we might experience and live more fully into what God desires for us, whoever we are. We too continue to need to experience salvation. And we can do that more fully together than we can by ourselves. And that's why I became Moravian. Because when I read the Ground of the Unity, and I read the Moravian Covenant for Christian Living, I saw an emphasis, as Craig said, on what it means for us to treat one another like Jesus would. And that in itself will teach you what it means to trust in Him. When you learn to live into the example of Jesus. You don't need to get specific about the doctrine. If you're not treating one another as Jesus would treat each other, we're missing out. And so the practice of community is it's not secondary, but it actually becomes the means of discipleship. The way that we learn to follow Jesus is by hearing and sharing Jesus as He becomes known in and through us, as God becomes in and known through us. Discipleship in this world is complex. You have to adapt to your own situation. We're going to close in just a moment, but I'd like for you to see an example. A lot of we're going to be talking about not just what Craig shared, but in this presentation and also this afternoon. This is ecumenical. This is part of the heart of our theology and history and heritage and tradition is the recognition, honestly and humbly, that we don't know all the answers. That we are sharing in partnership, not just with each other as Moravian Christians, but also with people across traditions. And so this is a story of an Episcopal church in Massachusetts that has asked a lot of these questions. And this is just one story to add to our discernment for today. The pastor notes that it took years before their relationships with the children and families resulted in anybody joining their community. But you also notice that their ministry to the children in their neighborhood was not about recruitment. It was about caring for their neighbors. It was solely because they wanted to care for their neighbors. And in that motivation, they developed relationships with their neighbors. And through developing relationships with their neighbors over time, because there was a relationship, there was trust. Trust that had eroded began to be rebuilt. And it changed them. There was something familiar in their experience of what was taking place. There was something also very unfamiliar. She said it made some people very nervous. I loved the lady who you could see was very active. She said, it took me weeks before I would even go into the basement because I could hear the noise, the sounds of the children, and I just was too uncomfortable. So there's crossing barriers, crossing boundaries, and we learn not just about each other, but we also learn about ourselves. And that, I think, is a part of what we can reclaim, is getting to know each other again, and how important and transformative that can be, not just for you and me, but for all of us.